Title: How CEO James Reacted When Trang Mistook His Lover Diep for a Maid. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday at the James family estate. The sun was warm, the garden was in bloom, and James, usually caught up in boardrooms and investor meetings, was finally able to bring Diep home. She had hesitated at first, self-conscious about her simple clothes and countryside manner. But James had held her hand gently and whispered, "You belong with me, no matter where we are." As they stepped into the elegant hallway, James was called away for a brief business call. That was when Trang, the sharp-tongued cousin visiting from abroad, walked in. She glanced at Diep's modest clothes, her hands still a little rough from the fields she loved tending, and raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you must be the new maid," she said casually, waving her hand. "The laundry's piling up." Diep froze, her cheeks flushed red, her heart squeezed. She wanted to speak up but felt suddenly too small, too out of place in the luxurious home filled with polished marble and cold glances. She quietly turned away, hiding the tears that welled up, when James returned and saw her sitting on the back patio alone, head bowed, something twisted in his chest. "Diep, what happened?" She hesitated. She never wanted to cause trouble. But as James gently urged her, the truth slipped out. His smile vanished. A long silence. Then, without a word, James strode back into the house. His footsteps were cold thunder across the tiles. He found Trang sipping tea in the living room, legs crossed like a queen. She looked up, unaware. "Trang," his voice was ice. "I heard you mistook Diep for a maid." She laughed. "Well, I mean, look at her." "Enough." The room fell silent. "Diep is not a maid. She's the woman I love. And if you think her worth is measured by her clothes or bank account, then you're the one who doesn't belong in this house." Trang's smile faltered. She had never seen James like this, calm, but furious. "This house does not run on silk and champagne. It runs on kindness, respect, and knowing what truly matters. You owe her an apology, and you owe yourself a lesson in humility." Later, James's mother approached Diep with soft eyes. She gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and said, "Sweetheart, I raised James to see hearts, not status. You have a beautiful one. Some people take longer to learn." Just as warmth began to return to the evening air, James received a call. His expression turned sharp, protective. He ended the call, looked at Diep, and held her hand tighter than before. "There's something going on. I need to keep you safe." And in that moment, Diep knew no matter what dangers lay ahead, she wasn't alone. Continuation: A storm beneath the calm. The atmosphere grew tense after James's cryptic words. Diep could feel that his grip was tighter, his eyes scanning the surroundings, no longer just a lover, but a protector. That night, James insisted she stay at his penthouse in the city. She hesitated, feeling out of place again, but he smiled and said, "It's not about the walls, Diep. It's about who they shelter." But even within the towering skyscraper, shadows followed. James received another call late in the evening. He turned away from her to answer, but Diep heard his voice low, serious. "You're sure it was near the farm? Keep an eye on her. No mistakes this time." When he hung up, he tried to smile, but the weight of something unsaid sat between them. "James, what's happening?" she asked gently. He sighed, walking toward her, cupping her face in his hands. "I didn't want to scare you, but someone's been watching you, near your house, near the market, even today, at the estate." Her eyes widened, fear flickering like a candle caught in wind. "But why me?" He hesitated. "Because you're with me, and some people I trusted want to hurt me, and they think hurting you would be easier." Silence. Her heart pounded. "You should have told me." "I know," he whispered, "but I thought I could fix everything before it reached you. I was wrong." Diep didn't cry. Instead, she stood up straighter. She looked out the window at the night city, lit up like stars. "Then let them come," she said softly. "If they think I'm just some poor girl with no voice, they'll be surprised." James looked at her, astonished. This wasn't the shy, tearful girl from earlier. This was someone who had faced storms before and still stood tall. "We faced them together?" he asked. She nodded. "Always." But as they embraced under the pale moonlight, a camera lens clicked silently from a nearby rooftop. A figure in black ducked away into the shadows, vanishing like smoke. The game had just begun. Title: Whispers of the Past, Daggers in the Present. A few days passed in a strange calm to quiet for comfort. James became increasingly preoccupied. His calls more frequent, his face more tense. Diep noticed, but said nothing. She had her own thoughts tangled like vines, pulling her back to a time she tried to forget. One morning, while James was out at a board meeting, Diep received an envelope slid under the door. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single photograph, her, at 16, standing beside a man in a prison uniform, her father. She froze. The edges of the photo were worn, like it had been passed through many hands. On the back, written in sharp black ink, "Does James know the kind of family you come from?" Diep sat down, the room spinning. That part of her past had never been revealed. Her father, a former financial criminal, imprisoned for fraud, blamed for a scandal that ruined families in their village. She hadn't seen him in years, and now someone was using that truth like a knife. That evening, James returned home to find her unusually quiet. "What's wrong?" he asked. Setting his briefcase down, she showed him the photo. He looked at it, then at her. For a long time, he said nothing. "Do you hate me now?" she whispered. Her voice cracked. James stepped forward, took the photo, and tore it in two. "You are not your past," he said softly. "You are not your father's mistakes. And anyone trying to shame you with this," his voice darkened, "is playing a dangerous game." She broke into tears, but they were tears of both fear and relief. But just as they began to recover from the emotional blow, betrayal struck from a closer place. James's assistant, Toon, had always been loyal, or so James thought. That night, James found inconsistencies in internal reports, fund transfers he hadn't authorized, projects delayed without reason, and most damning of all, a hidden email chain between Toon and John. Yes, John. His former investor turned enemy, the man who had tried to ruin him. James's heart turned cold. "He's been leaking information for months," he murmured. Everything made sense now: the attacks, the threats, the sudden exposure of Diep's past. It was all part of a web spun by those who once smiled to his face. James clenched his fists. "They want to destroy me," he said. "They want to take you, my company, my name, everything." Diep stepped forward, her hand on his chest. "Then let's give them something they didn't expect," she said, fire in her eyes. "Let's fight back with everything we have." James smiled faintly, his love for her deepening beyond words. But neither of them knew that the next move John was planning would threaten more than reputations. It would put lives at stake. Title: Shadows return when least expected. It was late. Rain tapped softly against the windows as James and Diep sat across a table covered in documents, tracing every lead that could expose Toon's betrayal. Suddenly, the front door buzzer rang. James checked the screen. An older man stood outside, soaked, silent, unfamiliar yet strangely familiar. Diep moved behind James and gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Bah." James turned to her. "That's your father?" She nodded slowly, heart pounding. The last time she'd seen him, he had been led away in handcuffs. James opened the door, and the man stepped in. He looked thinner than she remembered, but his eyes still held that sharp, calculating gleam. Diep, he said, voice rough from years of silence. I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. I came because you're in danger. Both of you. James narrowed his eyes. From who, John? The man shook his head. John is just a pawn now. The people backing him. I used to know them. We were partners once. Before I went to prison, I hid something from them. Something they're now convinced you have. Diep stared at her father. Why now? Why come to us after all these years? Because if I don't, they'll come for you. And this time, they won't stop at threats. James leaned in, voice calm but edged with steel. What do they want? The man looked at both of them, his daughter, and the man she loved. Then, in a low voice, he said, a ledger. One that holds the names of corrupt officials, shell companies, blood money. I never gave it to them. I hid it in something only you would recognize. Diep. Her breath caught. Her childhood music box. She had brought it with her when she moved in, with James still sitting on the shelf in the bedroom. Everything clicked. They rushed upstairs. James opened the music box and, beneath the velvet lining, found a folded sheet of old paper sealed with wax. A name was written across the top. Min Corporation. James's blood ran cold. Min, as in CEO Min. The charming, soft-spoken man who had recently entered their lives, showing interest in helping rebuild the company. And secretly, in Diep herself. Was he part of the game? Diep looked at James, fear and betrayal trembling in her eyes. What have we gotten ourselves into? James closed the box gently, looked out the window into the night, and said, a war we didn't start, but one we will finish. Life lesson. True worth is not defined by wealth or status. In a world often dazzled by luxury and power, it's easy to judge people based on what they wear, where they live, or how much they earn. But the story of Diep and James reminds us that kindness, loyalty, and inner strength matter far more than material wealth. Diep, despite being misunderstood as a maid, carries herself with quiet dignity and compassion. James, though a CEO, chooses empathy over arrogance. Their connection grows not because of riches, but because they see and protect each other's hearts. This teaches us, respect should never be based on social class. Kindness is powerful. It builds bridges where judgment destroys. True love and trust are tested not in comfort, but in chaos. So whether you are someone striving to be seen or someone in a position to lift others up, remember this: see people for who they are, not for what they have.